right. Well, it's really a great pleasure to be here tonight with you on this really nice spring night. Hopefully you're not hearing the leaf blower in the background outside. But it seems like a wonderful opportunity to ponder what makes a good citizen. So tonight I want to share with you a story of 40 men, all Irish Americans, who boarded a ship in New York City over 150 years ago in the spring of 1867. And they sailed to Ireland on this ship, a brigantine called the Jacmel. This was no pleasure cruise. On board the ship, you had 40 men, as I already suggested. They were almost all of them Civil War veterans, and they were all members of an organization called the Fenian Brotherhood, formed in 1859. In the hold of this ship, there were 5,000 rifles and revolvers, 1.5 million rounds of ammunition, and 3 pieces of artillery, all packed and disguised in piano boxes and sewing machine cases and wine casks. So what were these guys up to? They were destined for Ireland, and their goal, in one of the men's words, was to, quote, revolutionize Ireland. In other words, they were determined to drive England out of Ireland and to establish a free Irish republic. The mission soon ran aground. Once they get to the south coast of Ireland and they disembark off the coast of Dungarvan, they are quickly arrested and whisked off to prison in Dublin. So very soon, it seemed within a couple of months, the revolution was over, or was it? That's the main point I'm going to be making. There's much more to this story that happens after they're arrested. What followed was an international battle between the United States and Britain. And it got so bad that some people were worried that war might actually break out between the two countries over this incident. And it was all over something called the right of expatriation. And if you don't know what that means, it's okay. I'm going to talk about it very shortly. The Fenians did not secure Irish independence in 1867, but they did spark a really important international debate over citizenship, and it centered on 2 major questions. One was, what obligations did individuals owe to their governments? And the flip side of that was, what obligations did governments have to their citizens or subjects? Ultimately, this controversy ends with dramatic changes in domestic and international law on citizenship. And so it poses sort of a puzzle. How could these 40 men on this pretty rundown brigantine, men whose critics called them brainless, blundering Irishmen, how could they revolutionize the law of citizenship? So I'm going to try to answer that question in the remaining time. And just to kind of give you a roadmap for the road ahead, I'm going to be highlighting kind of 3 important contexts for understanding how 40 guys could change international law of citizenship. One thing that's really important is the international context, and that when this event happens, the United States had been in having a conflict with sending states, countries that were sending immigrants throughout the 19th century. So the international context is really important. The second context is domestic. The event highlighted and dovetailed with domestic conflicts over the incorporation of foreign-born Americans. And finally, it's very important that this whole event happens right after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era. And this is a really rich period of history in America, particularly for the history of citizenship, because this is when Congress opens up the constitutional door to define citizenship for the first time and to elaborate what rights citizens had. So there's our roadmap, and I want to begin by giving you some background. And perhaps most importantly, we might want to know, who were these guys, the Fenians? Some of you probably know already. I have to admit, when I started this research project long ago, I had never heard of the Fenians. I know a lot more about them now. So the Fenians, if you can see here, represented as this warrior woman with a sword, very fierce. They were a transnational organization. So their two strongholds were in the United States and in the United Kingdom. But you would find branches of the Fenians wherever Irish immigrants settled. It's really difficult to know how many people belonged to the Fenian Brotherhood. It was supposedly a secret society, but not that secret because the Fenians were very visible and very noisy. On July 4th, 1865, for example, the Fenian Brotherhood marched in a St. Patrick's Day parade in Manchester, New Hampshire, alongside veterans of the Civil War and multiple other civic groups. Historians estimate that there were about 250,000 members of the Fenian Brotherhood in the United States, but many more would have sympathized with this group if they weren't actual members. Who joined the Fenians? People like John Warren of Clonakilty in County Cork joined the Fenians. He could be seen as sort of a typical Fenian, and he was one of the co-commanders on the Jacmel expedition. John Warren is born in Ireland in County Cork, as already suggested, to skilled artisans. And he is comes to age in this period of the Great Famine. And that is particularly important to understanding the Fenians' motivations. As you know, I'm sure the famine had incredible, devastating effects in Ireland. Over 1 million Irish died during the famine. 1/8 of the total population. This map indicates the loss of population by county in Ireland, with the purple being the greatest, the highest percentage change, and then the tan color, the second highest. Not only did over 1 million people die, double that, 2.1 million Irish left Ireland, fleeing to the United States and other countries. That left a country that was totally devastated, losing so much of its population in such a short time. County Cork in the south, where Warren was from, lost 40% of its population in that time period. And you can see here on the right, just to go back to this slide, in a drawing of a woman begging for money from passersby. This is a picture from Clonakilty, where Warren was from. And she's collecting money to bury the dead child that she holds in her arms. So Irish are pouring out of Ireland, but they carry with them bitter resentment about being driven out of their native home. They blame Britain for the famine, and they leave feeling as if they have been exiled. This sense of bitterness, resentment will fuel the Fenian Brotherhood's movement. As I already suggested, many of them end up in the United States. John Warren, the man from Clonakilty, ends up in Charlestown in Boston, Massachusetts. And in many ways, he seems to settle right in. He gets an education. He's only 18 when he arrives. By the time of the Civil War, he has a thriving business as a grocer and liquor dealer. He marries another Irish exile, and they have 4 children. And he becomes a naturalized American citizen, as you can see here on the right. At the time, naturalization was available to anybody who was, quote, a free white person, and who had lived in the United States for at least 5 years. As required by law, Warren swore an oath to the United States. And as part of that oath, he, quote, absolutely and entirely renounced his allegiance to his former sovereign, Victoria, Queen of Great Britain and Ireland, and then swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States. However, well, not however, I'm also going to mention that many of these Irish Americans also fought in the American Civil War, as including John Warren in the famous Irish Brigade, reinforcing their sense of owing allegiance to the United States and supporting it in its time of trial. About the same time that Warren swore allegiance to the United States and became a US citizen, he swore another oath of allegiance to the Fenian Brotherhood. And that process, he swore to quote, he swore his allegiance to the Fenian Brotherhood, saying, quote, "I will labor while life is left to rid Ireland of English government." So by the end of the Civil War, the Fenian Brotherhood is at its peak. And you can see here this particular image that they're preparing for the next war, which they think will come in Ireland to defeat the English. What's interesting is how elaborate the organization is. The Fenian Brotherhood holds annual conventions, and they set up a governing structure which mimics that of the United States. So they have a president, they have a Senate, and they even have a Secretary of War that raises a Fenian army. They had a flag, as you can see here, that looks kind of familiar. It has stars and stripes. These are obviously green and white. There are 32 stars, one for each county in Ireland. They adopt a constitution as well that also has a familiar ring to it. Its preamble begins, "We, the members of the Fenian Brotherhood, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, and ensure domestic tranquility." So as you can tell pretty readily from these words and these images, the American Fenians really identified quite strongly both as Americans and as Irish, borrowing on American Republican ideals. They saw very little conflict in swearing allegiance to both the United States and the Fenian Brotherhood. The Fenians agreed that there was only one way to free Ireland, and that was by physical force. But then they disagreed a lot. They were a very combative group. They disagreed over strategies. One group said the best way to free Ireland is to invade Canada. And if you want to talk about that in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about that in a little more detail. But in June of 1866, they launched 3 raids from the United States into Canada. The first from Eastport, Maine into New Brunswick, the second from Buffalo into the Niagara frontier, and the third from St. Albans, Vermont into Quebec. These are all over pretty quickly. The one that lasts the longest is the so-called Battle of Ridgeway that is launched into the Niagara frontier. It didn't look anything like this. It was not nearly as orderly. It was much more chaotic. They last a few days, and they do succeed in killing 9 Canadians before they are driven out. The other group said, we shouldn't invade Canada. What we should do is go directly to Ireland and stir up trouble there, bring men, bring arms, and bring the revolt directly to Ireland. And that's what the Jack Mell expedition was about. It's renamed Erin's Hope on its voyage to Ireland. And its goal is to aid the Fenian Rising of March 5th, 1867. This was they had been planning forever for a rebellion. It finally erupts in March. It is made up mainly of guerrilla attacks on police and military installations. And the Jack Mell sails to help them out. As I already mentioned, if you see down here in the bottom part of the map, this is where they land. When they get there, they find out the rising has already been put down. They're arrested and thrown into prison. And they will cool their heels in the Comminum jail of Dublin. which is the notorious political prison in Dublin. Well, their rebellion really gains traction. When they are arrested, they are tried for treason. And it's this particular charge which provokes a huge international ruckus, which many feared, as I suggested, would drive Britain and the United States to war. And it's all over this thing called the right of expatriation. So as I promised, I'm going to explain what that means. Perhaps you know. After years of doing this topic, most people that I talk to don't really know what it's about. But the right of expatriation is very simply the right to leave your native home and to swear allegiance to another country. In other words, it's the right to change your nationality. So every year, hundreds of thousands of foreign-born people swear allegiance to the United States and become American citizens. In taking the oath of allegiance, they are exercising their right of expatriation, but I'm pretty sure that nobody ever thinks of it that way. It has become what I would call a forgotten right or a lost right. And part of the puzzle is, why have we forgotten about this right to change your nationality? And it's especially potent because in the 19th century, Americans talked about this right as being incredibly precious. They knew what it meant. They would declare expatriation, quote, a natural right bestowed on man by his creator, as sacred a right, as inalienable as the rights of persons and of property, as important as the liberty of speech and religion. And it was this right of expatriation that sparked this international controversy. It had to do with the fact that the United States had adopted very different notions of citizenship than that embraced by Britain and most European countries at the time. When the Fenians were arrested, they get arrested in Canada as well. As I suggested, they're tried for treason. And the Irish American Fenians protest mightily. They say, we're American citizens. You have no jurisdiction over us. And the British, and they say, I want to see my consulate. And the British dismiss their claim, and they do so with the phrase that never failed to irritate Americans by saying, once a subject, always a subject. By this, they meant their allegiance was perpetual. Born under the British rule, subjects had no power to rid themselves of their obligations as a subject, and Britain could always have power over them until they died. Well, obviously Americans, especially with their revolution, had adopted a very different notion of citizenship by embracing volitional allegiance, this idea that people chose to become members of a government and a society. The United States had been battling Britain over these different theories of allegiance since the revolution. And we can think about the revolution in some ways as being sort of a mass act of expatriation. These were not just theoretical differences that people wrote about in philosophy books or political theories. These had real life consequences. They had real life consequences for migrants as they left their native homes and tried to set up their lives in new countries. They also had consequences for countries who were very busy at this time, nation states, trying to secure control over their territorial boundaries and to make sure they had jurisdiction over all who lived within the boundaries. So in the beginning in the 19th century, where you begin to have modern mass migration, people are moving around a lot and really testing where one country's authority begins and the other ends. So they're on a collision course, these two countries, and in part because European countries see their subjects and their citizens as really valuable resources, and they put up barriers to their exit. This is perhaps even most clearly seen in Germany, the German states at the time. They saw their citizens as soldiers, as workers, and they did not want to lose these resources to other countries. To leave a German state was often quite complicated. Today, countries bar entry. That's where their focus is what right, how, what people need to do to get inside a country. In the 19th century, it was often more difficult to leave the native country than to get into a new one. And in Germany, you had to jump through all kinds of hoops to leave legally. You had to get an exit permit, and you had to show you had paid all your debts, but especially that you had performed your compulsory military service. This collision between the United States theories and European theories of allegiance came to a head often, for example, in the War of 1812. Now, textbooks tell us that the War of 1812 came about in part due to British impressment of American sailors. But what's important to remember is that a lot of these American sailors were actually naturalized Americans, born in Britain and then had become naturalized. So the British Navy, the Royal Navy, is boarding American ships and plucking off people who they say are British subjects who still owe their allegiance to the British monarch and must perform their military service. So war follows in part because of this conflict, as the United States objects. They say, these guys are Americans. You can't take Americans and put them in the British Navy. The war ends, but the conflict over expatriation does not. The treaty does not resolve this issue. And indeed, as migration to the United States peaks in this period, we see a big rise beginning in 1840 of migrants to the United States. Over 4 million come to the United States. 70% are from Germany and from Ireland, the countries with whom the United States had the most tension over this issue. So this had been bubbling behind in the background, and then the Fenians came along and kind of stirred the embers up into a fire, you might say. So the Fenians arrive, and they are stepping into an international controversy that has been brewing for years. And they are very determined to provoke a controversy. And the hope is that if they can get the United States and Britain at each other's at loggerheads and perhaps even provoke a war, that Ireland will become independent in the process. It's important to also remember that tensions were already very high between the United States and Britain due to the United States accusations that Britain had been unduly sympathetic to the Confederacy during the Civil War, allowing the Confederate raider, the Alabama, to be built in English ports. This particular ship did incredible damage to the Union forces, and the United States remained quite bitter about that. So how are they going to provoke this tension and make it worse? John Warren turns out to be pretty key in this. He likes to think of himself as a military man. People who went to his trial took a look at him, as you can see here in his picture, and they said, he looks more like a grocer or a clerk than a soldier. And indeed, his real talent was writing. He was a journalist. He had a way with words, and he had his own newspaper, the Fenian Spirit, published in Boston, Massachusetts. And he used his way with words to poke people at home and poke people in Ireland. He would declare when he goes on trial, so they're writing letters, they're publishing newspaper articles, and they're particularly using Warren's trial to dramatize the situation. When Warren goes on trial, he will say, "My case is your case." And he's speaking to the American people. What he says that what's really at stake in this trial is not my guilt or innocence. It's the honor of the United States. And it's a test of America's power in the world. Was the US going to let British say who was or who was not an American citizen? In his final speech before he was sentenced at his trial, so this is a picture of the courtroom in which he was trialed in Dublin before 3 judges. Warren will admonish the Anglo-Irish judges that, quote, "By British law, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin lived and died British subjects, and you could have hung the whole of them if convicted of high treason." So there he's trying to argue that, the British are really overreaching and that all Americans are potentially in danger. But what he also says, what's also at stake is not just American honor abroad, but also American honor at home. So this has to do with some of how these trials are handled. So Warren was a naturalized American whom the British claimed to be their subject. He was sentenced to 15 years at hard labor for his part in the Jacmel expedition. William Nagel was another commander of the Jacmel expedition. He was different in only one way. He had been born in the United States to Irish immigrant parents, and that made him a native born, a US born citizen. They're treated very differently. Nagel is let go because of his citizenship. And we see this headline in an Irish newspaper, "He is set free," all in caps. They, of course, are delighted that Nagel is set free, but really what they're getting at is, how could this be that Nagel is set free while Warren is doing hard labor in an English prison? This difference in the treatment of these two men really reflects a growing anger among the foreign-born in the United States that they continue to be second-class citizens, even though under the Constitution they're supposed to be equal, aside from not being able to run for president. They feel that they are treated very poorly. And this is where the domestic context comes in. Even though America welcomed immigrants in the 19th century and needed them desperately, there was considerable hostility towards immigrants in this period. Perhaps a lot of you already know about the Know Nothing movement of the 1850s. This was created by so-called Native Americans, not indigenous peoples. That refers to native-born Americans who raised the alarm about the dangers that they see immigrants posing to the United States. They particularly fasten on the number of Catholic immigrants that are coming into the United States. They think Catholics are a dire threat to the United States and its future. By 1867, Know-Nothingism has died down, partly because of how valiantly Irish Americans and German Americans had fought in the Civil War. But there's still a lot of snarky comments being made about Irish Americans, and they're portrayed in quite unflattering ways, as you can see in this cartoon drawn by Thomas Nast. We see here a pretty typical image of an Irishman always being portrayed as a gorilla or a monkey with simian features, and as dangerous and drunk. So this whole incident really, and the perceived failure on the part of the US to step in to defend the Fenians, taps into this brewing fight at home over the role of foreign Americans in American society. It's especially poignant because of the period of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, again, is this era where the Congress is opening up the question about who is a citizen, what rights do people have. Many of the foreign-born Americans feel they're being left out. The head of the Fenian organization will say, are naturalized Americans American? If they are, they deserve better protection. I'm going to skip this slide for the sake of time. You will also see a sense that other groups seem to be getting more attention than foreign-born Americans. There is definitely a politics of racial resentment that is present in these debates. George Francis Train is probably the best example of this. Train was a flamboyant character. He owned a shipping line that was dedicated to immigrants, and he was a very popular speaker at the time. And he comes to Boston to give a speech to raise money for John Warren's family. And he will say this to great applause: "Where are your members of Congress? As usual, moaning and groaning over the blacks. White men are not citizens. Irishmen have no rights. Your congressional delegation are bound to respect." So this kind of bubbling frustration and sense of being left out of the Reconstruction era legal reconstruction is very appealing, and it starts to be very successful in rousing not only Irish, but also other foreign-born. So newspapers report there are tons of rallies of foreign-born Americans demanding that the United States protect foreign-born abroad and define and protect in law this right of expatriation. And in the end, they're successful, which is sort of interesting. So in July of 1868, one day before the 14th Amendment is adopted, which guarantees birthright citizenship, Congress passes the Expatriation Act of 1868. This declares that the right of expatriation is a natural and inherent right of all people. It further requires the federal government to protect naturalized citizens in the same way that they would protect native-born citizens while abroad. What's even more important is that the United States negotiates naturalization treaties with at least a dozen countries between 1868 and 1872, all of which recognize the right of expatriation. And perhaps most strikingly, given how much British had clung to this idea of perpetual allegiance, Britain passes a very dramatic new law in 1870, giving up this doctrine of perpetual allegiance. Once a subject, always a subject. So Warren, the issue seems to be resolved. Warren and the remaining Fenian prisoners return to the US by 1869. Interestingly, when Warren gets home, he rallies against the naturalization treaty between the United States and Britain. What happened to his passionate defense of the right of expatriation? Well, Fenians had really been wanting to provoke a war, right? They were really after the independence of Ireland. Ironically, what they accomplished instead was not pushing the Great Britain and the United States further apart. In fact, the Fenians brought them together, closer together diplomatically. Both the US and Britain decided it was better to clarify the law on citizenship, come to some consensus rather than being held hostage to groups like the Fenians. The Fenians decline, and in the aftermath of this event, although it's important to note that other Irish nationalist organizations would soon arise. This is in the year 2022, Ireland is celebrating the centennial of the creation of the Irish Free State, and it's the creation of the Republic of Ireland. So that's what happens to Warren and the Fenians. What happens to the right of expatriation? It seems, on one hand, you would say it's very secure. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, includes the right to leave a country and the right to change one's nationality as fundamental human rights, seemingly a victory for the right of expatriation. But then the question is, why, if it's so secured and it was the subject of such great controversy in the 19th century, why don't we have a better knowledge of it today? Why is it a forgotten right? And that's what I want to end just with a couple of comments about my thoughts about why it's forgotten. Expatriation was actually is a really bold idea, right? Because it included not only the right to give up one's nationality, but it really also implied the right to leave, the right to migrate, the right to leave, and the right to migrate. But it would butt up against another key right that had a long history, and that is state sovereignty over territorial boundaries. So this right of expatriation began to falter as debates over the relative right of migration over the right of countries to control their borders. Within 20 years, less than 20 years after the Act of Expatriation is adopted, the United States will adopt the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. This would forbid the further immigration of Chinese laborers. By 1924, the United States will adopt the Quota Act of 1924, its most dramatic immigration restriction act ever. That dramatically lowered the number of immigrants allowed to enter, targeting Southern and Eastern Europeans in particular, and also barring all other Asian immigrants. So these laws really expose a fatal flaw in the right of expatriation, as this slide suggests. The right to exit did not necessarily guarantee the right to enter. As one commentator said at the time, every citizen of a foreign country has at any time the right to expatriate and to naturalize himself, provided, of course, that country consents to receive him. No country is prepared to have citizens poured into it like water into a bucket, but prefers rather that they should come through some sort of filter. And those filters for citizenship would reflect the same racial and gender hierarchies that structured other civil and political rights at the time. So to bring this to an end, I do want to be able to have questions. I would suggest that the right of migration and of expatriation became forgotten, in part because they became so overshadowed by restrictive immigration regimes in the 20th and the 21st centuries. So thank you very much. I look forward to any questions or discussions you might have, comments you might have.
Thanks, Lucy. We really appreciate it. And what I'm going to do is encourage people to start putting some questions in the chat. There are a few that have already come.
Mike, I can't hear you.
I hit unmute and then I hit mute again. Sorry, that's the problem of looking at three screens. So thanks, everybody. If you go ahead and want to start putting some questions in the chat, there are a few there already. Thanks to Lucy for doing this. This is the part where normally there would be applause if we were in person. So I'm sorry that we don't do that very well on Zoom.
Thank you.
While people are thinking of some questions, I just should mention that this is part of this ongoing series. We would like to encourage people to come to the keynote speaker for this is Claudia Rankin, the poet and playwright, who will be speaking in person on May 26th in Manchester. So we do encourage people to join us for that. And we do have one more of these Friday night online series coming up as well. We do also thank the National Endowment of the Humanities that has supported this program, and also thank all of you. Many of you out there are also supporting us, and we do appreciate that. So it looks like questions are pouring in, so I better get to that. I'm going to start with a question from William, who was the first person to jump in. And William was asking about Fenian insurrection in Canada, which you had mentioned, Lucy. Was there not a Fenian insurrection in Canada? Was that separate from the invasion? What was going on there a little bit, I think, is what William was asking.
There were Fenian, there was, what am I trying to say? There were many Irish immigrants in Canada, and there was a robust Fenian organization in Canada. Not nearly as strong, I think. There have been other really great books written about the raids into Canada. The hope was that if Irish Americans invaded Canada, they expected to be welcomed with open arms because, of course, Canadians are also oppressed by the terrible British, and that they expected perhaps people would rally together, and then having created more support, that they would start to spark more rebellion against England and also encourage greater alliances. The reality, even those who are sympathetic to the Irish, however, are just furious. They don't see this as a particularly welcome invasion. And even those who had immigrated from Ireland and who were supportive of Irish nationalism were not supportive of this particular strategy. I don't know if that answers the question fully.
Sorry, I'm coughing. I'll look for follow-up questions there. The next question, I usually only use the first names, but because this is a former student of yours, Marcia Schmidt-Blaine was asking a question.
Hi, Marcia.
The right to expatriation, it sounds like Americans approved of the change of national allegiance. How does this idea work with the Confederacy if former Americans were deciding to join the Confederates, especially since it's around the same time? It's clearly different, but how is it different, and what is that about?
Well, thank you, Marcia, for the hardball question. That is the $1 million question, Marcia, and I haven't totally figured that out, is the honest answer. One of the reasons why you don't have the United States passing an expatriation act until after the Civil War has a lot to do with how complicated citizenship was, whether it rested with the states or the federal governments, but it also dealt with this very uncomfortable question about the of secession. I have not been able to find a lot of explicit conversations after the Civil War coming to terms with how to treat ex-Confederates and whether they too had a right to expatriate. So it's a really important question, and I've had that question several times, and other people are working on it. So hopefully they're going to come up with a better answer than I can. But maybe Marcia has an idea about it too.
Marcia, you should jump in if you do. Otherwise, I'm going to jump to a question from Matthew. Matthew had a very practical question. There was a slide you had shown, Lucy, that was beware Native Americans, and it was an American flag slide. And Matthew was picking up the fact that there was the letter N was stenciled backwards, and there were some strange things about the print. And was that intentional, or do you have any sense of what was going on there?
I have no idea whether that was intentional. It does come off looking, I don't think they were trying to indicate anything with that, but I don't know the provenance of that particular map. And so I don't know, but it comes across as very homemade. And perhaps somebody, I don't know why they got their ends backwards, but I don't think it's symbolic of anything.
I have a question and a comment from Tom. Tom thought this was an excellent presentation, so thank you for putting that in, Tom. Also wanted to know the origins of the name Fenian.
It goes back to Fianna, which is an ancient, I'm probably saying it wrong, Fianna, but an ancient Celtic warrior and a warrior band. This is my understanding. I'm sure there are people out there that have more extensive knowledge of Celtic folklore than I do, but it is an ancient warrior who in a society that was early on pledging to defend Ireland. So the Fenians, very much as Irish nationalists, are trying to develop the Celtic background, the Celtic language, but also Celtic mythology, and look in the past for strong examples of Irish warriors and role models for the fight against Britain. So I think that's why they choose that name.
So a question from Helen, who wants to know how the concept of dual citizenship fits into this.
It's a really good question. In the 19th century, the whole, hi Helen. In the 19th century, the whole goal was to get rid of dual citizenship. So that's why these countries actually come together. These various countries say we can't have overlapping citizenship. It's just going to make our lives miserable. And we need to really harden and sharpen the territorial boundaries and the jurisdictional boundaries to say, you know, that person's yours and this one's mine. So we don't get caught up in these kinds of international controversies and wars. And there was also a sense, you know, this is a time of the growth of nationalism and the growth of nation states. So there's also a sense of beginning to say you can't have divided loyalties. And so they will talk about dual allegiance. They would call it dual allegiance, not dual citizenship, as being akin to bigamy, right? So you have to choose one partner, marry one country and stick with it. Then you might get divorced. You could leave and get divorced and marry somebody new, a new state. But they really thought this was a terrible idea, having more than one allegiance. It was too messy for individuals, but also for countries. Clearly, that has changed. People travel with 2 passports, with 3 passports, at least for now. And the United States, for a very long time, was very resistant to dual citizenship. It has, beginning in the mid-20th century, begun to relax its restrictions, and it does acknowledge people who have dual citizenship. Not all countries do, however. You can still, not all citizens will allow you to keep your citizenship. You have to renounce. And you still have the renunciation in the oath, I believe, but the United States does not make you give up your US citizenship or your other citizenship when you become a US citizen. So it's a different mindset post World War II with more globalization and travel. There's a whole set of reasons why dual citizenship has been more accepted in recent times.
Carolyn was wondering if there were any groups pushing for Irish independence in a non-violent way during this time period.
Yes. So there's definitely, oh boy, I can't believe I'm blanking on who's the major character that pushed for Irish independence. So there were lots of different kind of in between solutions, and one would have been for home rule, right? So home rule that they would stay part of the British Empire, but there would be greater independence for local conditions. And those people, many of the people who were involved in the home rule and the earlier movements felt that you could achieve that through political means, through negotiation, and rejected violence. So that was certainly another major movement. The Fenians were very impatient with that movement. They did not, and the Irish nationalists, Sinn Féin and others, would think that was foolish, and you would never get independence if you waited for the British to agree voluntarily. I'm trying to. Well, I think that I'll end my comment there. I was trying to come up with the person's name, but it's not with me today at the moment.
There's a question from TW, and I'm going to try to get this right. And this is one of those details, right, that it might come up in your research, but you had mentioned the CSS Alabama and the Commerce Raiders.
Yep.
And the TW had heard that there was a connection between the Confederate Commerce Raiders with James Bullock, Teddy Roosevelt's uncle, who was never allowed back into the United States. Is that any part of the history that you've? I
have no idea, but that's an interesting tidbit. No, I have no idea. There might be somebody else on our talk that our Zoom session that might know, but I haven't known that. That's fascinating.
So there's also a kind of a follow-up on the dual citizenship question from Lois, asking if there's a connection really between retaining citizenship in the country one leaves, if that has a link to those who don't have to struggle for the right to be here in the United States in the first place, right? Whether there's particular countries that have an easier time of doing that than others. Being white Anglo-Saxon Christians, is that, what is there a connection between the countries, or is there what country you're coming from or looking for dual citizenship?
So are you saying that are certain groups more able to avail themselves of dual citizenship than others? Okay.
And is it, go ahead.
I don't think so, but I will, because a lot of it really depends on the country where you already have citizenship, whether they're going to let you retain it. So I know that there are several Middle Eastern countries, for example, which do not, Iran, I think, is one of them that does not recognize the right to relinquish your citizenship and to retain, to be dual citizens. And often, so I don't, it's certainly the case that certain groups coming from certain countries will have a harder time entering the country, which is, part of you need to be able to enter to be able to become a citizen. And that may find the naturalization process more expensive or more costly or more difficult to attain. So there's that part of it. One thing, just in terms of dual citizenship, that's pretty interesting is that in some ways, it's another reason why we see a return of dual citizenship is that many countries have seen it as advantageous to retain connections to their the people who leave. So Mexico, for example, but also Italy, they extended dual citizenship because they find it advantageous to continue to have connections to their native peoples, right? That they, in terms of monetary support, people sending home remittances, cultivating a sense of connection to their home country. They see this as beneficial, whereas before countries, began to think of this as negative. They some felt that this was a tie that should be fostered on the behalf of the countries. But I don't see any can't think of particularly discriminatory practices in terms of whether certain groups are more able to avail themselves of dual citizenship, but I might be wrong.
We've got one more question I think we can get in. It's just after 6 o'clock and people have been really good to stay with us for all this time. And you've been good to kind of answer questions through all of this. Thank you. We did have a question. You had mentioned the frustration with the focus on African Americans during the Reconstruction rather than the Fenians or other groups. Did that cause conflict? I think is really the heart of the question here between Fenians and African Americans at that time.
And so what is the question then? Or
did this cause conflicts between the groups at that point in time?
Yes, it did. And this is, this has been one of the thorny parts of the project is that there's a great deal of racial tension. And, US citizenship is very much defined in racial ways in the 19th century. As I mentioned briefly, just to become a naturalized citizen, you had to be white and free under the 1790 naturalization law. that white requirement will be in US law until 1952, which is sort of incredibly amazing, right? That for that long, one had to be white to become a naturalized American citizen. So that I offer that just as a way to think about the extent to which citizenship in the 19th century was defined very much along racial lines and also along gendered lines. So when people are talking about the right of expatriation in the 19th century, even though they're talking about it as a natural right that belongs to everyone by virtue of them being people, that they're really, it's really is mostly talking about white European men in terms of their right to be able to change their citizenship. Joanna Madigan, the wife of John Warren, has no choice about her citizenship. Her citizenship is determined by whatever John Warren decides. So her citizenship is determined by her marriage. There is a long history of antagonism between Irish and African Americans. Not all Fenians adopted these attitudes. I don't have any proof that some of the major guys I've studied had racist sort of attitudes. But in this heavily racialized society, and you had competition between Irish Americans and African Americans for jobs, for status, it often seemed to Irish Americans that the way to get ahead was to distance themselves from African Americans and to say, we're not like that. So that fed into this debate in unfortunate ways. And also with Chinese. Chinese also became targeted by European immigrant groups, especially Irish Americans.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending. That's going to be the end of our program for tonight. You can join us next month on Monday, June 6th at 5:30 p.m. for Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II with Matthew F. Delmont. And of course, also our keynote with Claudia Rankin on Thursday, May 26th, in person and live streamed. Also, Ideas on Tap is back. Ideas on Tap is back. Our first event is next Monday, the 9th in Manchester, and we'll also have further ones coming up. The one after that is May 16th in Keene, so you can check for more information for that. A reminder that these programs are brought to you in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities and also for supporters of NHH. If you'd like to support our work, you can learn more about us on our website. You can also find information there about future talks and other programs, sign up for our e-news, and learn about upcoming events. So once again, thank you, Dr. Salyer, for your talk, and thank you for everyone attending. You'll be receiving a survey via email, and it does have some substantial questions about the presentation tonight, not just demographic information. So if you could take the time to fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.